The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. In last week's edition of Challenge 2.0, we examined the claims and counterclaims surrounding the simple act of voting. This week, we look at possible solutions to the controversies, solutions which in themselves could also be controversial. Obviously, this is going to be an issue of great importance as we move through the years yet to come. We have two wonderful guest panelists that are going to help lead us through possible alternatives. First, I'd like to introduce Brianne Schuster from the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington. Brianne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And from the League of Women Voters of Seattle-King County, we have Alyssa Weed. Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, absolutely. Very happy to be here.
Well, I think as we look over the past weeks, months, it seems like years, that people have been subjected and involved in probably one of the most vitriolic campaigns that I can remember. Probably very few people want to repeat this experience. I think if we were to begin, as is often said, at the beginning, what are the structural problems that have made this experience so painful and so pervasive this year?
Okay, I mean, we can start in 1776. No, I'm kidding. Bad maps and big money. I think those are the two things that I can kind of point to immediately that have just kind of chipped away at our right to vote in ways that are super obvious, as well as ways that are not super obvious. I mean, if you just think about which voters are voting for which candidates, and when you feel you don't have a good option or you don't have a candidate who represents your community, you can look at a bad map. And if you want to know who draws those maps, you can look at money in politics. So those two, they really are the bad news bears, and they work together very insidiously. So it would be my two things that I think anybody interested in pro-democracy efforts should really hone in on.
Brianne, what's your perspective on that?
There's so much that we really need to reform to ensure that we're actually engaging in a democratic system where people can have their voices heard, right? And I think, Alyssa joked, but I mean, some of this really does go back to the founding of our country and is rooted in the history of who we allowed to vote and who we didn't allow to vote. And even as we're slowly chipping away at that, we're seeing many states regress, right? And we're seeing, we had this historic, which certainly didn't give us everything, and then we had a lot more work to do, but we had this historic Voting Rights Act that in the last decade, we've seen so many attempts to erode the basic protections of that act. We're seeing states implement restrictive registration requirements, voter IDs, closure of polling places, purging polling rolls. I mean, I think within 5 years of the Shelby decision in which the Supreme Court struck down a component of the Voting Rights Act, we saw nearly 1,000 polling places closed. And I think we're seeing, obviously, the impact that COVID is having on that. But we have populations that have been long excluded altogether from the electoral process and continue to be, both through voter suppression and voter dilution. Alyssa alluded to districting, and I think that certainly can have an impact. But we also have winner take all at large election systems. And so in Washington, for example, the vast majority of jurisdictions use at large election systems, which means that the entire city votes for 7 representatives, say you have on city council. that can often dilute the vote of communities of color who might be 47% of the population, but because of the sort of the election system coupled with polarized voting, they'll never elect a representative onto that city council. So that's a big issue that we have across the country, but it's a really big issue in Washington.
Let's look at these in greater detail because those are all important points. I think the term that was used was bad maps, and we've also heard the term gerrymandering. Maybe give us a little bit of Politics 101 and explain what gerrymandering is and why that comes to be.
Oh, I would love to. Okay, so gerrymandering is basically the process of manipulating district maps to favor a particular political party or section of society. So gerrymandering is named after Elbridge Gerry. He was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812, and he basically drew district maps that people said looked like a salamander. So that's where we get gerrymandering. It's a cute, charming little historical anecdote for something that is like super insidious and very, very dangerous. It happens all over the place. Washington is getting better. But I mean, you can look at a district map and it is the shape of like an amoeba and it doesn't make sense. So like you and your neighbor can be voting for a different slate of candidates based on an arbitrary districting line that was not drawn by anybody in your community. But it very much negatively affects you and your family. And we see it so that non-white communities are carved up so they have less voting power. We see communities that don't have capital being carved up so that they don't have any voting power. And it really is kind of just this way that we very much legally protect the status quo. And it is absolutely something that everybody should keep an eye out for, call it out when you see it. So yeah, gerrymandering, bad maps, whatever you want to call it, it's real bad.
What can be done about that? What needs to be done about that then?
Yeah, so we need to change who draws the maps. And that seems like a really easy thing, but it's actually not. So the voting boundary process, it determines the political representation of our communities. And so Washington is one of only 9 states that has a redistricting commission that's independent from the direct legislative control. So pretty much after decades of duking it out, we were able to create a 5-member redistricting commission in 1983, I believe. And so it's a bipartisan commission, and it does require 3 of the 4 voting members to agree on the specific maps. So that's great. But obviously, that's not the case everywhere. And because the commission doesn't meet, every day and they rely on census data, keeping that up to date and keeping that really reflective of the people is something that we need to keep an eye on as regular citizens.
Brianne, how about your perspective on that from ACLU then?
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. So thanks, Alyssa. I think, and what I really appreciated that you highlighted that I think a lot of times gets lost in the conversation when we talk about gerrymandering is we often talk about it, or, when the media is talking about it, it's often partisan, right? Like the Republicans or the Democrats are using gerrymandering for power. And that is certainly happening. But it is also happening very much to uphold white power specifically, right? And to dilute the power of communities of color. And so I really appreciate that, we're talking, it's not just an issue about Republicans versus Democrats, and gerrymandering has been used to manipulate boundaries and predetermined outcome of elections in many really, really horrible ways.
How much of that relates to the census that's taken too? And was there not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a shortened census this year, but I think that's just been overruled. What's the situation on that, and how does that relate to this process of bad unrepresentative maps or gerrymandering then?
So one of the concerns about a shortened census is that populations that are typically harder to count, so renters, folks that are low income, younger children, that they'll be undercounted. And so that would certainly affect how districts are drawn. We also know that historically people of color, particularly Black Americans, are severely undercounted. And so that would, a shortened census would probably exacerbate a lot of those issues. And then of course you have COVID-19, which is making it all the harder to engage in census counting because it's harder to go door to door and get folks that are a little bit harder to reach. People experiencing homelessness is another population that is, very difficult to count. And so when a community is undercounted, that means that, there's this erosion of political power and less federal funding. And a lot of states use census data for districting.
Yeah, I'll just add that census data really is the data that is available when we talk about allocating resources, when we talk about how many members of Congress your community gets to send to DC. It is the way that we count, frankly. So having a shortened census and having cuts to census workers is something that everybody should be concerned about, regardless of what party you're in, if you identify as a member of a party or not. Even if you're not a voter, census data, if you want potholes taken out of your streets, they want to know that people actually live on that street if they're going to spend the money to do it. So census data is really the gold standard for how we even know what communities are in need.
Alyssa, you mentioned the word gold, and that brings us to the next part of the topic that both of you brought up, and that is money in politics. I'd ask, because that's a big topic, we could easily do a program on that, but what has been the worst example that you can each think of, and how might we set about, practically speaking, in reducing its influence?
Ooh. Okay, just off the top of my head, the Seattle City Council election 2 years ago, was it 2018, where we broke records and people were spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to buy 2 seats. And, depending on where you fall on the political ideology scale, it either was or was not a successful use of money. But everybody should be real concerned that a certain one named business in this town is legally able to literally buy a seat on the city council. And we see that through advertising, we see that through, consultants that are charging hundreds of thousands of dollars for a month of work to get you in office. And, who are those people going to pick up the phone for when they're in office if they would like to return to office? Certainly not me. Nobody wants to answer my calls because I'm not giving them $100,000. So that to me is kind of one of the biggest things that I can point to locally. We were big sponsors of the democracy ordinance that passed in 2019, or it was the beginning of 2020. The years, they just keep coming. That kind of tried to really curb that kind of behavior, limiting how much money foreign-owned companies could put into our local elections, kind of curb down on PAC spending.
And Brianne?
Public financing is one thing that could really have a positive impact. I think a lot of times we talk about kind of caps on spending or who's spending what money, but the reality is that if people don't have any money, they're never going to be able to run for office. And that's just never going to be competitive, even if, we cap it at $1 million or whatever. But I think it's challenging. It's a really challenging issue, and I think it requires a lot of reform all in the package together. It's not just like one silver bullet fix. I wish it were. I would have done it already, or I would have tried to do it already. So I think, yeah, I think we need a lot of different things. I think public financing is one of them. I think, you know, to the extent that places have restrictions about disclosure and like those things actually need to be enforced, and we need to have we need to have the funding to be able to actually do what our laws say they're supposed to do. It's challenging, and it's hard to see the millions of dollars being poured into these electoral campaigns when we're, you know, at the dawn of this recession that we're constantly being told there's not enough money to provide people with healthcare. There's not enough money to provide people with housing. And then we're seeing like this, you know, flush of funds used for TV ads so that somebody can like represent and bring the healthcare and the housing to people. And it just, to me, it's such a disconnect in what folks are needing right now.
We hear that the Electoral College is an anachronism, that it disenfranchises people. Do both of you agree? And if so, what do you think is the best way to address that problem?
I think the Electoral College and the ACLU has long opposed and been concerned about the Electoral College. And I think it's another issue that can often be talked about in partisan terms, right? Like the Democrats are opposed, and and the Republicans like it, and we are, as a nonpartisan organization, have completely nonpartisan reasons for opposing it. And one of the reasons being that it violates the principle of one person, one vote. One of the things that we different affiliates have been kind of talking about is the National Popular Vote Act. So where states would enact a law requiring electors to vote for the winner of the national popular vote. I think there are challenges, unfortunately, fortunately or fortunately, right? I think there's many reasons, many good reasons. It's hard to overturn components of the Constitution, and rightfully so, because I certainly don't want like the first, any of those great amendments that we have just being taken from us because of who's in power. So I think that's important, so I think there's a lot of challenges to doing it through a constitutional amendment. And so I think legislatively, state by state legislation is probably the most realistic way to go. But I'm eager to hear if Alyssa has additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, so at the national level, the league does support the National Popular Vote Bill, and kind of encouraging states to really take it into their own hands legislatively. Because yeah, when you have the Constitutional Convention, it opens up a whole bag of worms, and we would prefer to avoid that. But yeah, we don't believe that the Electoral College is super representative of the people. We've seen, several elections where the winner has lost the popular vote, which again makes people upset when we think about the history of the Electoral College. It literally was to strengthen the voice of the landholding gentry. And that's just not cool anymore. I mean, like, it was never cool, but I think people are actually seeing that it has real consequence. So we have encouraged other states to kind of jump on board the National Popular Vote Compact. And I think right now it's been passed by 16 states. That might be incorrect. But so yeah, it is picking up some momentum, and that is something that the league definitely supports.
Let me ask you this question. The other element that we hear a lot about is on voter registration. How are our voter registration procedures broken? And probably that could take up all of our fingers and toes, but what do you think is the best method for getting people registered to participate in elections?
I'm a big fan of automatic voter registration. So when you're 18, boom, you're in the system. Because that way you just get a ballot if you're in Washington, and you can vote. We've got pre-registration now for 16 and 17-year-olds, which I think is awesome. But we have low turnout for the amount of people we have registered. So when we think about registration, we can think about it as it's a full sell. You want to let people know why it's important to register, but also like the follow-up, right? Because a registered voter is a great blank canvas for turning somebody into a fully fledged civic-minded person, but not if we're not following up with them, not in election years. We have a tendency to ignore people, 3 out of 4 years, and making sure that communicating regularly with people is so important. Because voting is very transactional. So just kind of maintaining relationships with people and with communities and making sure that they also feel empowered to register their friends, to take a voter registration training, to become advocates in their own right.
Mm-hmm. Brianne, what's your take on that issue of voter registration?
Yeah, I think there's two sort of critical pieces. And the first is that people are able to register in a way that's accessible to them, right? So whether that is via mail, whether that's via person, whether that is whether, they're signing up for other things, and have that registration available to them. So I think that's super important. And then I think the other piece is making sure that we're not putting up barriers to registration and what is required to actually register, right? So in Washington, thankfully it is easier than in other places. There's still a lot of work to do, but making sure that people don't have to prove where they're residing, or that they can use a non-traditional address, for example, to register to vote, that they don't have to have a government issued ID in order to register to vote. So making sure that we have those things in place, that it's relatively easy and accessible for people to be able to do that. And a lot of those things are present here, but we still have work to do.
Okay, last question, and I won't promise this is any easier, but over the last election cycles, we've seen social media manipulated to provide extensive disinformation. How do we begin to address that?
Yeah, that is a super important topic when we talk about voting. I was just thinking the other day that it is pretty crazy that we have people all in the same platform. We've got 60 and 70-year-olds who are late adopters of technology, coupled with people using the same platforms who have never known a time without smartphones and internet. And then we've got people in the middle who grew up maybe reading traditional news sources, who now are getting news from social media, and they might have a little bit higher of a media literacy skill. And so I think it really does come down to making sure that we are figuring out how to communicate with people in a way where they can understand that not everything they see on the internet is real, but that the internet is a very powerful tool in the democracy toolbox, right? Because it connects, it educates, it empowers, it advocates. But we just really got to ramp up the media literacy in this country. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of other countries. And so there's a lot of programs right now out there where you can do trainings on how to spot a troll or how to fact check an article. And I think making that something where when we onboard anybody onto the internet, whether they be, a third grader with a tablet, or you're setting up your elderly parents' Facebook account for them for the first time, just kind of being like, hey, just so you know, if you come across a profile that looks like it was started a month ago and all they post about is Russia, they might not be a reputable news source.
So, Brianne, that brings up an interesting issue, especially for ACLU, the freedom of information and to express, but then also this issue of disinformation. How do you see this? What necessary evolution do you see?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. Because I think it's complicated, right? I appreciate the point that you made, Alyssa, about which when you're in school or younger, and you kind of learn what an accurate source is, and just that's been so upended in many ways by just the way that the internet and social media has changed. In ways that I don't think anyone anticipated, 10, 15 years ago. And so I appreciate using public education and all of us kind of working collaboratively together to address that and be responsible for it. But the right to free speech is also an important one. And of course, it's not, it applies when the government is restricting it. So it's, I don't have to let anyone post something on my social media just because it's their opinion or they feel a particular way. So that's not what it's intended to protect. But what a good law would look like, I think is really challenging to make sure that people are getting accurate information, but also that we're protecting folks' First Amendment right to free speech. And I know that's something we're thinking about a lot. And there's also a lot of folks like in our data privacy and liberty and our First Amendment projects that are thinking a lot about that too.
Well, we're going to have a full checklist of things to go after in the coming couple of years to make sure that the next elections are perhaps less subject to some of these problems that we've talked about. Alyssa and Brianne, I thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you'll maybe consider joining us again as we get a little bit down the road and say, what corrections do we need to affect at this point? So again, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to put contact information on the screen so that those of you watching at home can make full use of the resources that both of Alyssa and Brianne's organizations offer. So again, our thanks to our guests and our thanks to you for joining us on this week's edition of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll tune in again next week.